John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to the John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. And today we're reading Hellblazer issue number 132. And just a little catch up before we get into that, John and Chaz have gotten themselves involved with the mob. And this came about because Chaz owed some money to them. And instead of being able to pay that off, he did a job where he was a driver for someone. And he didn't know it, but it was actually for a hit on one of the higher ups of the Cooper family mob. And when he realized what he was doing as the driver and what was going on, he freaked out, and he did the only thing he could think, which was to go to John for help. And it turned out that John actually knew these guys before because he had been asked by Norman Cooper, whose son was hit by a car when he was 5, to raise his son from the dead. Now, of course, John can't do that, but he did the next best thing he could do, which was put a demon inside the boy, and hopefully the Coopers would be satisfied, and they were. So for the last 15 years, John hasn't really thought about this, but now he's wrapped up with that family again. So in the last issue, we saw him trying to figure out what's going on with this demon. And he didn't quite figure it out last issue, but he did find out that there's something going on with the possessed boy, Ronnie Cooper, and babies, because he went to one of their brothels that they run, and the madam there told John that whenever one of the prostitutes gets pregnant, they don't abort it. They actually save it and then give it to Ronnie and Norman Cooper. And John found out where they stored those bodies, so he found a Hellraiser-esque type of scene with babies in a freezer and meat hooks and stuff. And it was all pretty creepy. But that's pretty much where we left off with John. And then the other thing going on is the gang war that's about to happen because the Coopers are trying to figure out who tried to assassinate them. And it turns out, we found out at the end of the last issue, that Little Ronnie, the possessed boy, was the one who put the hit out on Norman Cooper, his uncle. And it was also that he could start a gang war with the other mobs in the city, and then they would take over and win, and then control the city. So that's where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with issue 132, we got the cover. We keep with the same motif of a half of a face in the foreground and stuff going on in the background. So the face that we see this time is the face of little evil Ronnie, and he's looking pretty creepy with his smile and his gigantic eyes looking out at us. And in the background, we can see what I assume is the mob war going on. We have a bunch of people fighting and killing each other in the streets. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Garth Ennis with art by John Higgins. And as we turn to the first page, we get the beginnings of that gang war I was speaking about. And in the first panel, we see a bunch of people dead in a house, and it looks like there's been a shootout. And then there's one man surrounded by 3 guys in ski masks. And the man that's surrounded is supposed to be, I believe, a leader or a member of an Irish gang, and he's yelling at the men, "You stupid fucking bastards! What do you think you're doing? My brother will fucking kill you for this!" And then one of the men who's got brass knuckles says, "He's welcome to try, Kelly." And then another man surrounding him with a shotgun shoves the barrel in Kelly's mouth and says, "Think that's the whole sodden idea." And we can assume that he pulled the trigger, but we don't know for sure because we cut away from that scene to another scene of people committing violence against someone. And this time it's against a black person, and they're pulling him out of bed, and his wife or girlfriend is crying, and we see him being restrained by 2 men as another slowly walks towards him with a knife out. And I'm not sure if the man who's being restrained is part of the Irish gangs or if he's a member of another gang, but either way, they're threatening him now, and he's saying to them, "But I don't even know Eamon Kelly. I never fucking met him, man." And then the man with the knife walking towards him says, "No, but you'll do." Then we turn the page and we cut to another scene of these mob hits going on. And this time it's inside of a pub. And we see 3 men kick in the door, and they have shotguns and face masks on. And it seems like one of the patrons was on a phone, and he obviously looks like he's in the mob because he's got a suit on and stuff. And he's talking on his cell phone, and he's saying, "But who would want to fucking kill? Oh, fuck!" As the 3 men break in and he turns to see them. Then we cut to a man being shoved in a trunk, and he's tied up, and he's yelling, "Scum! Scum that you are! Eamon will get you for this! Every fucking dirty bastard by the name of Cooper!" But he's cut off as the trunk is shut, and then the car with its gas pedal pushed down so it can drive on its own takes off and drives off the docks into the river. Then we get a panel of a Molotov cocktail flying through the air, and as we turn the page, we get a very symbolic look at what's going on because we see a map of London burning. Then we cut to the house of the Coopers, and we see little Ronnie standing and looking out of a window, and his Uncle Norman is behind him, and Ronnie says, "Are all the fuckers dead, Uncle Norman?" And Norman replies, "Everyone you said, little Ronnie. Christ, we've lit a right bleeding fire here tonight, ain't we? They're all going to be out to get us now." And then a big smile comes over Ronnie's face, and he says, "Super." And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Son of Man Part 4. Then we turn the page and we cut to John sitting on the edge of the bed of Sylvia, his lesbian neighbor who he had sex with in the last issue. And it looks like she might be regretting what happened between them because she's holding the blanket in front of her breasts and she's saying to John, "I don't want to argue about it, okay? I just think it'd be best if you left." And John says, "Fine by me." And then Sylvia, who looks pretty distraught, puts her head in her hand and says, "I can't believe this. I can't believe I did this. I mean, my God, what the hell was I thinking? Carol's going to be furious. She's going to go completely mad." And John turns to her and says, "Well, don't tell her." And Sylvia says, "But I'm supposed to be. I'm not even meant to feel. Oh, God." And John tries to make her feel better by saying, "Look, love, there's no point on giving yourself a hard time over this, all right? You wanted to, so you did. That's all there is to it. It's not like you have some big rule book to tell you what you want to." But he stops himself as he looks up in the mirror over the bed and he sees the reflection of Carol in the mirror and he says, "Fuck." Then we turn the page and we cut to Chaz, who's in his taxi cab, and it seems like John was telling him what happened with Carol because Chaz is asking him, "Oh boy, so did she join in?" Then we get a panel of John who's got a black eye and he says, "No, Chaz, she didn't." And Chaz smiles and says, "Fucking shame." And then John lights a cigarette and says, "You know real life's not like the stories you read in those magazines, don't you, Chaz? You do know that, right?" And Chaz looks confused because he asks, "Do what?" And John just replies, "Forget it." And then he changes the subject by asking, "Anything new at your end?" And Chaz answers, "Yeah, the way I hear it, the Coopers are trying to start World War III. Then we turn the page and we cut to Norman Cooper talking to Inspector McNabb and Gestapo. And Norman is asking McNabb, "But Tout, he might have been lying, mightn't he? Or heard it wrong?" And McNabb answers, "I seriously doubt it, Norman. Gestapo was slicing his eyelids off at the time." And then Gestapo smiles and says, "I certainly was." And Norman pauses to think upon hearing that, and he says, "But why? Why would me own fucking nephew want to stick a hitman on me?" Then from behind them, we hear little Ronnie say, "To start a fucking great big gang war, Uncle Norman." And then Norman turns very scared and says, "Little Ronnie?" And Ronnie, who looks kind of mad, says, "Less of the little, you horrible old poofter. Everyone knows some git tried to kill you the other night, don't they? Now we've done the Kellys and the Brixton boys. It'll look like retaliation. And we'll keep at it, too. Inspector McNabb, Mr. Gestapo, I'm Ronnie Cooper. I'm your new boss." And Norman asks Ronnie, "But why would you want to start all this trouble in the first place?" And as Ronnie walks by him towards Gestapo and McNabb, he says, "That's my business." And a defeated Norman says, So you stage a fucking hit on me. You don't even warn me." And then Ronnie pauses and turns to him and says, "Nothing staged about it, Uncle Norman. I told them to blow your fucking head off. I thought that'd be more authentic." Then Norman walks over to a chair and sits down and says, "Jesus." And as Ronnie approaches McNabb and Gestapo, McNabb looks down at him and says, "Hang on here a minute. What do you mean you're the new boss?" And little Ronnie looks up at them and says, "Just that. McNabb, you're well up in the Met and a complete shit into the bargain. Gestapo is to all intents and purposes a serial killer. You'll do nicely. Your first job is to kill my Uncle Norman." And as Ronnie says that, we get a panel of Norman's face and his eyes get really wide. Then we cut back to John and Chaz has stopped to get some fuel. And then we see John look at us through the window and breaks the fourth wall and says, "So anyway, about what I was saying before I got buried under a fucking avalanche of dead babies. Rick, Hedder, and Brendan thought they were on to a winner. A demon from hell and the Cooper family ready to do whatever they wanted. Nice one. Now, I was still bloody ropey, so I didn't fancy it at all. I put it off and put it off, but they pinned me down eventually. They knew me. Not quite well enough, as it turned out, but they knew me. Then we cut to a flashback of John talking to his three friends, and he's saying, I don't know what you're getting so fucking wound up about, lads. It's ours anytime we want it. Honestly, I've got everything under control. Then we get a panel of all three men looking at him, and they don't look like they believe him at all, and Rick the Vic says, Really? Then where's our fucking money, John? And John plays it off saying, Money? Oh, well, if that's all you're after. Then we cut out of the flashback back to John in the present day, who's telling us the rest of what he told them, saying, I told them I had to do it all by myself. Some old bollocks about the bastard only responding to the bloke who carved the sigil. I don't know. I'd let them know by the end of the week. Rick was the only one who got suspicious. Then we cut back into the flashback where John is talking to Rick, and Rick is saying to him, I've been doing a little research. And John replies, Oh? And Rick says, Yes. I thought it might help if we knew exactly what we were dealing with. And John says, What I'm dealing with, Rick. Then we see Rick pull a book out of a bag, and it looks pretty old and tattered, and he says, Quite. As I suspected, the featureless black figure we saw during the ritual is not how the beast normally appears. Instead, it's merely a proto-body. Arthurian practitioners of the art recorded it as the earthly disguise of this charming fellow here. And then he opens the book to a specific page that he's marked, and he shows it to John, and we don't really see an expression on John's face. We just see him take the book, and he says, Right ugly fucker, isn't it? And it seems like Rick is trying to read John's expression, maybe trying to see if John knows more than he's letting on, and he says, It seems to be some kind of incubus. Crops up in some of the Sodom and Gomorrah variations. Gets a mention or two in LaFay's secret diary. And then John says, Yeah, it's got a 3-foot cock, Rick. And he says that with a straight face, and Rick very seriously stares at him and says, Even with artistic license, I wouldn't like to meet it on a dark night. And John is still staring at the book, and he asks, What's this bit at the top mean? And Rick leans over and says, That's its name. Apparently, we are the captors. We are indeed the proud owners of a fuck pig. And then John smiles and laughs and says, You're taking the piss. And Rick takes a little sip of his glass and he says, Perish the thought. This is not a joke, John. It is primal, savage evil. It is the act of rape made flesh. Are you absolutely certain that you know what you're doing? And then John gives a big smile and he looks at Rick and he says sarcastically, Does the Pope fuck in the woods? Then we cut back to present where John is still talking to us as Chaz and him are stuck in traffic, and he's saying, Course, I didn't have a clue where to begin. Rick's discovery in the big book of bastards just made it 100 times worse. Eventually, I came up with sort of an idea, and to this day, I still really don't know how it worked. I did exactly what Chaz and me are doing now. I went to visit the Coopers. Then we see Chaz's car turn down the street where the Cooper's house is, and Chaz says to John, I don't know about this, John. I mean, Norman Cooper, he saw me driving when that bloke took that shot at him, didn't he? That's how this mess got started in the first place. And John replies, I'm sure he won't hold it against you, mate. Here, what's all this? And as John says that last line, we see Norman Cooper come out of the gated area from the front of his house, and he's running as fast as he can away from Detective McNabb and Gestapo. And when Chaz sees them, he says, Bloody hell, it's not, is it? It can't be. And John exclaims, It is. Then we see Norman running towards their car yelling, Help! Then John sticks his head out of the passenger window and he says, Want a lift, Norman? And Norman answers, Yes, Jesus, help! And as he jumps in the car, McNabb yells after him, Oi, stop! Police! Halt in the name of the law! But it's too late. John has pulled Norman into the car, and as they drive away, McNabb yells, Bollocks here! Then we get to inside the car, and we see Norman is kind of catching his breath, and he looks up and he sees John and Chaz, and John turns to him and says, Afternoon, Norman. And Norman gets very scared because he recognizes Chaz and he knows John, and he says, Fucking hell, you and him, help! Then we cut back to Gestapo and McNabb standing on the corner, and they're just kind of replaying the events that just happened in their mind. And Gestapo says jokingly, "In the name of the law," and McNabb replies, "Worth a try. Give us your phone a second, will you? I know that bastard." Then we turn the page and we see little Ronnie standing in the window, and he is talking on the phone to McNabb, and he's saying, "So he got away. Is that what you're telling me? You pile of shit, McNabb." Then we cut to McNabb on the phone, and he's saying, "Yeah, but Ronnie, listen. The bloke who saved him. I know him. He was in the house the tit with the gun ran into the other night." Then we cut back to Ronnie, and he says, "Describe him." And then we don't hear what McNabb says, but we just hear Ronnie say, "Yes, right. Actually, it does sound like someone. But what was he like?" And then we cut to McNabb saying, "A right mouthy little wanker." Then we cut to Ronnie, who's got an annoyed look on his face, and he says, "I know him. Find him, McNabb. Bring him back. Norman, too. And anyone else they've got with them." Then he hangs up, and he gets a big smile on his face, and he says, "Constantine." Then we turn the page, and we cut to John's flat, and he's talking to Norman, and he's saying, "Norman, for the 100th bleeding time, we haven't brought you here to do you in, all right?" Then we see Norman, who's sitting in a lazy boy chair, looking pretty shaken, and Chaz is pouring him some tea, and he's looking at Chaz very weird, and he says, "But this bloke here, he was driving the car, what?" But John cuts him off, saying, "Yeah, but that was a mix-up." And then in the background, we can hear that Mr. Franz is yelling the word pants repeatedly, and they can hear it through the wall. And so John says to Chaz, "Chaz, nip next door and tell Mr. Franz to pack it in, will you?" So Chaz leaves, and then John sits down in front of Norman, and Norman asks him, "So what do you want then?" And John answers, "Oh, well, where to begin? I want to know why the Coopers are on the warpath all of a sudden. What the score is with Harry. Why you've got a year's supply of dead babies in a warehouse over in Clapham. And what's little Ronnie been up to since I brought him back from the grave?" And then Norman looks at John and asks, Can you fix everything?" And John gives a little smirk and says, "You'd better fucking well hope so, mate." And then Norman begins to answer some of the questions, saying, "I don't know what's wrong with Harry, except that he weighs a fucking ton and talks bollocks all day. Starting all the trouble's little Ronnie's idea. I don't know what for, but Christ, everything's down to little Ronnie, really. The babies are his. Whatever it was you did to him, he was never the fucking same. And he never grew up properly, neither. It was like he got older on the inside, but not. At first we was all business as usual, but then I started to notice little Ronnie was always there when Harry was doing business. And then, after a bit, Harry was saying less and less, and Ronnie was saying everything. Little Ronnie runs the family, and he's 21 in the body of a 5-year-old, and I don't know what to do anymore." And at that moment is when Chaz comes back into the room, and he says to John, "Your fucking neighbors just showed me his..." But John holds up a hand, cutting him off, and says, "Quiet, Chaz. Norman's just getting to the good bit." And then Norman begins to cry as he says, "Little Ronnie wanted babies right from the start. Using the brothel was his idea, but he made me do all the organizing. You couldn't..." And then John cuts him off, saying, "He's 3 feet tall, Norman. Why didn't you just stop his pocket money or something?" And then Norman wipes his eyes and answers, "'Cause all he has to do is look at you, and you know that not doing what he says would be the biggest mistake of your life. Me and the lads would bring him around to Gresham's. He'd be waiting there already, and we'd leave him in the freezer with them. Sometimes he goes there for the ones he's got stored up. This one time, he left the door open a crack, and I couldn't help seeing, hearing." And he kind of pauses like he doesn't want to say the next thing, so John says, "Yeah?" And Norman finishes his sentence saying, "I think he drinks the babies, Constantine." And not shocked at all, John says, "Yeah, that makes sense, come to think of it." Like it's the most normal thing he's ever heard. And Chaz, of course, is freaked out by that, and he says, "Drinking babies? What the fuck makes sense about that?" And John turns to Chaz and says, "Oh, well, thanks for that stunning insight, Alistair fucking Crowley. What the bloody hell do you know about it? I mean, Norman over here's only got a fucking archdemon in his family, hasn't he? Some sodden-possessed brat's about to rip his town apart, and God knows what else. And all of a sudden, big bleeding expert Chaz Chandler turns into a fucking necromancer? Do me a favor. And as John says that whole little sentence, we see the eyes of Norman get very big because he realizes that Little Ronnie isn't his nephew brought back to life, but that there is an archdemon inside of his body. So while he's thinking about that, Chaz fires back against the insults John just said, and he says, "At least I know how to drive a cab." And then John just stares at him for a second, and then he says, "Getting pretty fucking lippy in your old age, aren't you?" And then John pulls out a cigarette, and he begins to explain everything to Chaz, and he says, "Drinking babies makes sense in this instance, because they're nice and fresh and young and innocent, Chaz. Nice, fresh organs to maintain its disguise, or that little kid's body'd be rotted to fuck by now. Nice, fresh souls to build its power, for whatever that bastard's up to." And as John says that last line, all of a sudden, the door gets kicked in, and Chaz screams, "Jesus!" And Norman stands up and yells, "Oh, God!" Then we see McNabb and Gestapo come in, and McNabb pulls his gun out, and he points it at John, and he says, "Evening, all." And John replies sarcastically, saying, "Fucking hell, McNabb. Talk about deja vu." And then McNabb kicks John in the balls, and he says, "Indeed." Then we turn the page, and we cut to the Cooper's house, and we see Harry Cooper sitting in his armchair, and he's talking nonsense as normal, and Ronnie's standing next to him and says, "Shush, Dad." "Well?" And then we get a panel where it's showing there's more people in the room, and we see it's McNabb and Gestapo, and they have brought Chaz, John, and Norman back to the house. And then Ronnie turns to them and says, "Here we all are then." And then Chaz says, "What the fuck happened to him?" And right as he says him, we see Gestapo rest an axe on Chaz's shoulder so that the head of the axe is next to Chaz and he can see it. And then Gestapo says to him, "It's not your turn to speak." And Ronnie smiles and says, "Quite, Gestapo." And then he looks at Norman and says, "I'm glad I didn't kill you after all, Uncle Norman. It'd be a shame if you missed this." And then Ronnie walks up to John and looks at him and says, "And you little fucker, I bet you'd like to know what it is you've caused." And then Norman says to Ronnie, "God's sake, little Ronnie, I don't understand any of this. What have you done? What's this all about?" And then Ronnie gets all sinister, and behind him we see his very bloated father, and he says, "Kelly's lot and the blacks are out in force. Everyone else is on our side, except those triad wankers. I sent a carload of boys into Chinatown an hour ago. Nobody gets to be neutral. It's all a question of setting the mood." Then out of nowhere, Harry Cooper, his father, begins to moan and make noise, and it seems like he's straining very hard for some reason. And McNabb yells out, "Fuck!" And Norman says, "Jesus Christ, Ronnie, what's wrong with him?" And Ronnie just smiles and looks at Norman and says, "He's fine, Uncle Norman. You see, tonight, when tossers are dropping dead all over London, when evil's preying on evil, when everything's lovely and black and sick and vicious, my dad's going to have a baby." And then he puts a hand on his dad's knee like he's proud of this baby. Then as everybody's taking all that information in, Gestapo says, "Oh, good. I love kids." And as he says that, the hatchet is kind of resting on his shoulder and glinting in the light, and he gives a very creepy smile. And then everybody turns because I assume the baby is about to be born and there's more noise happening, but we don't really see or hear any of that. We just see the shocked looks on their faces and the weird smile of Gestapo. And that is the end of the issue. So with that, I did want to say, if you guys are listening to this on podcast apps or anything, and you like us and you want to rate and review, please do. It helps us out, and hopefully more people will get recommended it in their feed because of those ratings. So if you wouldn't mind, that'd be awesome. And if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.